The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, has visited Syria's notorious Sednaya prison. The facility was recently reopened after the fall of the Assad regime. Thousands of prisoners were held there during his rule, and many detainees were tortured or even killed. Well, let's cross to Mohammed, who's live for us in the capital, Damascus. Mohammed, what more did we learn from Volker Turk today?
Well, first and foremost, Sarah, we heard from Volker Turk that this was a historic visit, that this was a first. The first time that a UN High Commissioner for Human Rights was visiting Syria. And in that regard, the High Commissioner said that he was optimistic that he was going to be able to work going forward with the new administration in Syria, along with civil servant organizations, in order to try to ensure that there is transitional justice going forward and that there is protection of human rights here in Syria. Now, one of the things that Mr. Turk said had most impacted him on his visit was the fact that he had gone to tour Sednaya prison, and that while he was there, he spoke to former prisoners that described conditions that they had encountered there that were almost too much to bear. He wasn't even going to repeat what he had been told as far as the kinds of torture and other horrific conditions former detainees there had told him about. Mr. Turk also mentioned that he had met with different civil society groups while he was here in Syria, and that he had discussed with them the need to try to ensure that there would be transitional justice going forward here in Syria. Now, one very important thing that Mr. Turk mentioned was the fact that he had met with Ahmed al-Shara. He's the head of the new administration here in Syria. And I asked Mr. Turk during the press conference, which took place here in this compound just a little over an hour ago, I asked Mr. Turk specifically about the tone of the conversation he had with Ahmed al-Shara, and if he had heard about any guarantees coming from the new administration that human rights would be protected, especially for minority groups going forward in Syria. Here's what Mr. Turk had to say.
We discussed inclusivity and the importance of inclusivity, not least benefiting from the richness of the society. I mean, it's clear that society and the social cohesion within the country can only be guaranteed if indeed each and every part of that society is able to get on with their lives. And that includes each and every segment of the society. And indeed, we heard some very positive statements from the leadership in that regard. Of course, a lot now depends on how it's happening on the ground, and there's a lot of work to be done. It's a very fragile transition period, but it will be absolutely critical to support the effort to build a new Syria that overcomes the legacies of the past.
And Mohammed, we're all talking here about a new Syria, but what have you been hearing from Syrians themselves, certainly in Damascus, when it comes to issues like transitional justice, for example?
Well, Sarah, by and large, the Syrians that I've been speaking with in Damascus over the course of the past few days have said that they are still hopeful, and they are very cautiously optimistic because they see encouraging signs by the new administration that things are being dealt with in an organized manner. But everybody that I've talked to said that they really need to make sure that there is going to be transitional justice. They want to ensure, they want to hear more, especially from the new administration, as far as when it comes to members of the Assad regime who committed crimes for so many years against the population here, who committed so many atrocities and so many brutalities against the population here. And they want to make sure that there are mechanisms in place to ensure that there is justice for those individuals going forward. They also, of course, want to ensure that more aid starts flowing into the country, that things are more organized when it comes to civil society institutions, and that the people here essentially are going to get all the help that they need, not just from the international community. They do want to see the lifting of sanctions, but also specifically from the government that is now in place here. Sarah.
Okay, thanks very much, Mohammed, for that latest update from the Syrian capital. Well, Olga Cherevko is the spokesperson at the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Syria. Thank you very much for joining us there live from the capital, Damascus. Olga, Syria has become one of the poorest countries now, it seems, in the world. How mammoth is the task ahead to be able to pull Syrians out of poverty, especially as reports by the World Bank and the UN are estimating that 1 in 4 Syrians are living in extreme poverty?
Yes, thank you, Sarah, for having me. You're absolutely right. The crisis in Syria is absolutely enormous, and it is very, very complex, and it always has been. Even before the events that we're experiencing now started to happen, we had, as you said, a population that most of it was living in poverty. 90% of the population is living in poverty. We had almost 17 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. People are worried about what they're going to eat today or tomorrow. There are 13 million people who are food insecure. And of course, the economy is in shambles, and the country has experienced 14 years of a brutal war. So this is how this change that we're seeing now came about. And of course, it has brought about another complexity, another layer, and it brought new displacement. At the height of these events, we had over 1.1 million people who were newly displaced. Some of them have returned, but we still have about 627,000 people remaining who are newly displaced. And of course, all of them, they need urgently need water and food, shelter assistance, and healthcare, and things like this.
And the director of the World Food Programme had said that some governments are hesitant to boost funding for urgent humanitarian needs in Syria. What sort of task is ahead when it comes to trying to convince the international community to do its part somehow in helping out?
Yes, that part is very, very important. I mean, the crisis in Syria has always been severe and widespread, but the opportunities that we have now, we've not had before. And these opportunities must not be squandered. The hope that we have for a new Syria must not be erased. So for the international community to come together and to ensure that Syria is supported in a meaningful way. So we're talking about not just life-saving assistance, which is very, very critical right now, but it's also meaningful investments in early recovery, in making sure that basic services are restored, that people can have something to go back to, that their livelihoods are restored. So this is really, really important, and the time is very critical, and if we waste this opportunity, everything could unravel very, very quickly again.
Okay, so time sensitive. What's the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs doing right now, and what's its plan? What's its next step?
Yes, so we were on the ground, of course, from the very beginning, and ensuring that the most vulnerable people, were reached with assistance as much as the logistics and the security conditions permitted. What's important to remember is that obviously the conflict and the crisis are far from over. So there's some fighting ongoing still, and there are minefields, there are explosive remnants of war all over. So these are also constraints on our work. But still, our partners and UN agencies, we're out there. We are looking at scaling up our assistance because obviously the needs are growing and the situation could deteriorate quickly. So some of the things we're focusing on are, of course, food assistance. So, for example, as of 12 January, the WFP and partners have provided about 2.5 million people with bread assistance and about 300,000 with other food assistance. So this is, of course, very critical. Our health partners are going out there to make sure that primary and secondary healthcare is available to patients through mobile clinic, through static locations. We had a cholera campaign that was just finished in al-Hol camp. There are, of course, rehabilitation of various facilities that we're looking into, and just a scale up across the board, because when we're talking about needs here, everything is a need.
Yeah, and of course, it's not just you're talking about the Syrians in Syria, but also the diaspora of Syrian refugees that were taken into many countries. Thank you very much for joining us with an update there. Olga Cherevko, the spokesperson at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Syria.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.